They didn't just Google your name. They traced your bloodline back 7 generations, and what they found made 3 separate intelligence agencies mark your file as classified. You thought you were living an ordinary life, maybe dealing with ordinary struggles. But while you were trying to pay your bills and survive your Monday mornings, someone in a windowless room was connecting dots about your ancestry that you didn't even know existed. And here's the part that should make your spine tingle. The moment they confirmed what they were looking for, your file got moved from standard civilian records into a category that doesn't officially exist. You're not in trouble. You're in a category they reserve for people whose genetic signature carries something they've been searching for across decades. This isn't conspiracy theory entertainment. This is pattern recognition that's been playing out in silence while you wondered why certain things in your life never quite added up. Why do random people seem intensely interested in you for no clear reason? Why have you experienced surveillance that felt too targeted to be coincidence? Why do conversations sometimes stop when you enter rooms? And why do certain authority figures treat you with a strange mixture of caution and curiosity? You thought you were paranoid. Turns out you were perceptive. And if you've made it this far without clicking away, that's already confirmation that something in you recognizes this message was meant for your eyes. Now, before we go deeper into what they found and why it matters, hit that like button and subscribe, because this information doesn't stay available forever, and the algorithm doesn't favor truth that disrupts comfortable illusions. Let's be direct about what's happening. Governments don't waste resources tracking ordinary citizens. They don't pull ancestry records and cross-reference genetic databases for people who pose no significance to their long-term agendas. But you carry markers they've been cataloging since before you were born. Your family line shows up in records that predate modern nations, in bloodlines that were documented by ancient orders, mystery schools, and lineages that understood power in ways contemporary society has forgotten. They're not interested in you because you've done something wrong. They're interested because your genetic code carries information that unlocks access to things most people can't even conceptualize. And the 3 governments watching you right now, they each want that access for very different reasons. Here's how you know this applies to you. You've always felt different, like you were operating on a frequency others couldn't hear. You've had experiences that defy rational explanation, moments where you knew things you had no business knowing, where reality bent in ways that should be impossible. You've been told you're too intense, too aware, too sensitive to energies most people don't even acknowledge exist. That's not a personality flaw, that's genetic activation. Your ancestors weren't mystics or prophets in the religious sense. They were individuals who maintained access to understanding that got systematically erased from public knowledge. And you, whether you've embraced it or fought against it, carry that same access in your cells. That's what they traced. That's why your file exists in databases you'll never see. The first government agency wants to know how you process information that appears before it's publicly available. They've documented instances where you demonstrated foreknowledge, not through psychic dramatics, but through pattern recognition that shouldn't be possible with the information you had access to at the time. They've logged your predictions, your seemingly random insights that turned out accurate, the way you navigate situations as if you've seen the ending before it plays out. They call it precognitive processing. You probably call it gut instinct. But when that instinct consistently outperforms their artificial intelligence models, You become a research interest. They don't want to harm you, they want to replicate you. The second agency is concerned with your resistance to standard conditioning protocols. You don't respond to propaganda the way statistically you should. You don't adopt beliefs just because they're repeated through authorized channels. You question narratives that most people accept without examination, and you do it not from rebellion, but from an internal compass that detects inconsistency like a fault line sensor. They've studied your media consumption, your information filters, the way you sort truth from manipulation, and it frustrates their behavioral models. People with your profile aren't supposed to exist in significant numbers. You represent a variable that disrupts social engineering at scale. They want to understand what makes you immune, so they can either neutralize it or, if they're smart, learn from it. The third government isn't even from the nation you live in. They're tracking you because your genetic markers match lineages they've been monitoring across continents for generations. Your bloodline appears in their historical records as part of families that held knowledge, held land, held influence before modern borders were drawn. They believe you might be carrying dormant abilities that activate under specific conditions, abilities that were once trained deliberately but have been suppressed through centuries of cultural erasure and genetic dilution. They're watching to see if you'll activate naturally. And if you do, they want first contact. Because in their framework, people like you are either assets or threats, and they prefer assets they can negotiate with before someone else makes you an offer. You weren't supposed to know any of this. The plan was to observe, document, and approach only if necessary. But here's where their plan encounters a problem. You're not predictable. You don't stay in the lanes they've constructed for civilian behavior. You ask questions that lead you toward information they'd prefer remained fragmented. You connect with others who carry similar markers, forming networks they can't fully monitor or control. And worst of all, from their perspective, you're starting to remember things you were never taught, accessing information that feels like memory rather than learning. That's the activation they've been waiting for. And now that it's happening, the timeline for those private conversations just accelerated. Your ancestors weren't royalty in the way history books define power. They were custodians of understanding that predates written language, knowledge systems that were encoded into family lines, because written records could be burned and institutions could be destroyed, but genetic memory persists across generations. They understood energy, frequency, and resonance not as mystical concepts, but as practical tools for navigating reality. They knew how to read patterns in nature, in human behavior, in the movement of information through communities, and they passed that understanding down, not through books or schools, but through bloodline transmission that activates when conditions align. What makes you different isn't superiority, it's continuity. You're a living bridge to ways of knowing that were systematically deleted from mainstream consciousness. The abilities you've noticed, the ones you've probably downplayed or hidden because they make you seem strange, those are ancestral tools coming online in your system. The way you sense people's real intentions beneath their words. The way you know when something's wrong before evidence appears. The way you can walk into a space and feel its history, its energy signature, the emotional residue of what happened there. These aren't supernatural gifts. They're natural sensitivities that most humans have had, trained out of them through generations of industrial conditioning. but your line maintained enough of the original code that it's still accessible. The tracing didn't start recently. Your family has been on watch lists longer than you've been alive, tracked through census records, immigration documents, property transfers, marriage certificates. Every generation, they check to see if the markers are still expressing, if the bloodline is still viable, if the knowledge is still encoded strongly enough to matter. Most lineages dilute over time, the signals weakening until they're just faint echoes in people who feel slightly different but can't access why. But yours didn't dilute. If anything, it concentrated. You represent a stronger expression of ancestral capability than your recent family line has produced in generations. That's why you're not just monitored, you're studied. They found records of your ancestors in archives most people don't know exist, libraries that aren't public, genealogies maintained by organizations that operate outside governmental oversight, family trees that connect to networks of other bloodlines, all carrying pieces of a larger understanding that was fractured deliberately to prevent its reconstruction. But you and others like you are reconstruction events. You're not trying to rebuild what was lost. You're remembering it spontaneously, organically, because it's written into your cellular structure. And when enough people carrying these fragments start activating simultaneously, when the network effect reaches critical mass, the power structures that have maintained control through information suppression face a paradigm collapse. That's the real reason for the surveillance. Timing isn't coincidence. Your activation is happening now because planetary conditions have shifted into alignment that favors genetic remembering. Frequencies that were suppressed are now accessible again. Information that was hidden is leaking into public awareness faster than it can be contained. The controlled narrative is fracturing, and people are starting to question everything they were taught to accept as fixed reality. You're not waking up in isolation. You're part of a wave, a generation of bloodline carriers whose internal systems are responding to environmental triggers that signal it's time to remember what was forgotten. The agencies watching you understand cycles that aren't taught in standard education. They know history moves in patterns. That knowledge goes underground during suppression phases and resurfaces when conditions permit. They've been preparing for this resurgence, building infrastructure to identify, track, and manage individuals whose genetic profiles suggest they'll be early activators. You are an early activator. The experiences you've had, the downloads of information that arrive without external source, the sudden knowings that feel like memory returning, these are signs your ancestral code is coming online, and they need to make contact before you fully understand what you're carrying, because once you do, negotiation becomes significantly more complicated. You've probably noticed synchronicities accelerating, numbers, symbols, encounters that feel arranged rather than random. People from your past reappearing with information or opportunities that feel destined rather than coincidental. Dreams that feel more like briefings than subconscious processing. These aren't signs of mental instability. They're signs of coherence, of your system organizing around a frequency that connects you to a larger network of intelligence. The agencies tracking you recognize these patterns. They've cataloged them across thousands of individuals worldwide. They call it spontaneous integration syndrome. You might call it finally becoming who you actually are. But here's what they didn't account for. Your bloodline doesn't just carry knowledge. It carries resistance to control. Your ancestors survived because they couldn't be fully domesticated, couldn't be completely absorbed into systems that demanded total conformity. That same resistance runs in you. It's why authority has always felt suspicious to you, why hierarchies seem arbitrary, why being told what to think triggers immediate internal pushback. You're not rebellious, you're encoded with sovereignty. And that encoding makes you fundamentally incompatible with agendas that require your compliance. They want a conversation because force won't work on someone whose genetic signature includes centuries of surviving attempts at suppression. When they make contact, it won't be dramatic, no black helicopters or midnight knocks. It'll be subtle, an unexpected job offer that seems too perfect, a research opportunity that aligns eerily well with your interests, a chance encounter with someone who asks questions that reveal they know more about you than casual conversation should permit. They'll approach through vectors that feel like opportunity rather than threat, because they've learned that people with your profile respond better to invitation than intimidation. But make no mistake, it's still a recruitment attempt disguised as friendly interest. They'll want to test you first, verify that you're expressing the markers their databases predict. They'll present scenarios designed to trigger your specific capabilities, watching how you process information, how you read situations, how you respond to variables that shouldn't produce the level of accuracy you demonstrate. They'll be polite, professional, even admiring. They'll frame it as collaboration, as contribution to understanding that could benefit humanity. And some of it might even be true. But the core agenda is acquisition. They want your abilities working for their objectives, your bloodline incorporated into their programs, your genetic material preserved in their repositories. You'll be offered things, resources, protection, access to information about your own lineage that you've been trying to piece together from fragments. They'll show you files on your ancestors, documentation of abilities that run in your family, evidence that you're part of something larger than you realized. And it'll be tempting, because finally, someone is confirming what you've always sensed but couldn't prove. But here's the trap. The moment you accept their framework, the moment you let them define what you are and what you're capable of, you've given them the authority to set the boundaries of your expression. And boundaries are exactly what your bloodline was designed to transcend. The conversation they want is one where they hold the power of knowledge, and you play the role of curious subject seeking answers. But you already have the answers. They're not outside you, waiting to be discovered in classified files. They're inside you, waiting to be remembered without external permission or validation. The agencies know this. That's why they want to make contact before you fully activate, before you realize you don't need their explanations or their resources. Because once you remember on your own terms, once you access the fullness of what you carry without intermediary authority, you become ungovernable. And ungovernable intelligence terrifies systems built on control. They'll increase observation. Passive monitoring becomes active tracking. They'll want to know who you're connecting with, what information you're accessing, whether you're forming networks with others carrying similar markers. They won't interfere directly unless you become what they classify as a destabilization risk. But they'll maintain awareness of your trajectory. You'll notice the signs if you're paying attention. Technology glitches at statistically improbable rates. Conversations that feel monitored. encounters that seem staged to gauge your responses. It's not paranoia if the pattern is real. But here's what matters more than their surveillance. Your refusal to engage on their terms accelerates your natural activation. Every time you choose internal knowing over external authority, you strengthen the connection to your ancestral code. Every time you trust your own discernment, instead of accepting prescribed narratives, you activate more of what you're carrying. They know this. That's why the recruitment attempt exists. They'd rather have you working within their framework than developing independently outside it. Independent activation creates variables they can't predict or control. And enough independent variables operating in coordination, even without formal organization, can shift entire systems. You're not alone in this. Right now, across the planet, thousands of individuals with similar bloodline markers are going through parallel activation processes. You're not connected through organizations or formal networks. You're connected through resonance, through the frequency your genetic code broadcasts when it comes online. You recognize each other without explanation. You share information without prior coordination. You move in patterns that appear synchronized but aren't centrally directed. This is what terrifies institutional power. Not individuals, but spontaneous coherence among individuals who don't need external authority to coordinate action. Your role isn't to fight the system. Your role is to outgrow it, to develop so far beyond its capacity to contain or define you that its relevance in your life simply dissolves. The conversation they want is predicated on you accepting that they have something you need. But what if you don't need anything they're offering? What if the only thing standing between you and full activation is your willingness to remember without permission? That's the possibility that keeps their analysts awake. Not that you'll become an enemy, that you'll become irrelevant to their entire framework because you've accessed a level of operation they can't interface with. Your bloodline wasn't traced because you're dangerous. It was traced because you're significant. There's a difference. Dangerous implies threat. Significant implies impact that reshapes context. You carry understanding that predates their institutions, that survived their suppression campaigns, that persists despite centuries of systematic erasure. And now you're here, in a time when that understanding is needed not as historical curiosity, but as functional tool for navigating the collapse of systems that have outlived their sustainability. The three governments want their conversation. Let them wait. Your conversation is with yourself, with your ancestors, with the code written into your cells long before nations drew borders or agencies compiled databases. That conversation doesn't require security clearance or official approval. It requires your attention, your willingness to trust what you know before you can explain how you know it. That's the activation they can monitor but never control. If this script resonated, you know what it means. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Drop 777 inches the comments if your bloodline just confirmed something you've always felt but never voiced. And share this with someone whose eyes will recognize the truth hidden in plain sight. Because some messages aren't entertainment, they're activation codes. And you just heard yours. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.